We're ready to start. So good afternoon and greetings from central Italy, where I currently am. My job now is to talk to you about the broader picture of disasters and their management and planning for emergencies, and also to give you some reflections on my 39 years and 10 months of studying these things. So I'm not specifically going to talk about COVID-19. I will, however, at the end, direct your attention to a fairly lengthy publication of mine, which you can download if you're interested in the relationship between COVID-19 and emergency planning and management. So, to look at the wider perspective, we really need to look at some of the things that connect with disasters. One of my messages today is that we cannot properly understand disasters unless we also understand the context in which they occur. And that means studying the other sources of human misery in their various forms and looking at, with foresight, what may happen in the future and what sort of challenges humanity will have to face at many levels, from the local to the global. Now, we have sort of renamed over the last 20 years the field as disaster risk reduction in order to make it more broadly all-embracing and to shift the emphasis from merely reacting to disasters to preparing for them, mitigating them, and generally encouraging resilience. But is this really what we are doing, or are we engaged in a process of disaster risk creation? Now, if you look at climate change, it is said that due to investment in fossil fuels, the creation of the problem receives about 1,000 times more funding than the measures to do something about it, because there are worldwide massive investments in fossil fuel exploration, exploitation, extraction, and so on. Now, I found on one occasion a publication that suggested that the cure to damage ratio for disasters is 1 to 43. In other words, that the world is spending about 43 times as much in creating the conditions for disasters to occur than it is in mitigating disaster. Now, I really can't comment on that because the source of that information did not explain its methodology, and I've not seen any subsequent follow-up to that. So this may in fact be inaccurate or untrue, but it is something that we can ponder. And there is no doubt that we live in an age in which we have a constant dialectic between factors that mitigate risk and factors that amplify risk. Humanity is constantly creating sources of risk at the same time as it is struggling to bring under control other sources of risk. The wild card in that is risk perception, which could go either way. Are we talking about perception of risk to the point that we wish to do something about it, reduce it? Or is risk perception something that we simply allow risk to occur or even welcome and embrace sources of risk? Of course, that is a highly complex question with many different answers around the world. But you can, for example, look at COVID, and you can see that there are risk takers and risk avoiders in the debate about what to do about coronavirus. And a very interesting dialectic develops between them as well. So, sorry, the screen has, there we go. Really, we need to develop the bigger picture. Pandemics are very definitely part of it, and it is worrying that a potential influenza virus has been discovered that could be the source of the next influenza pandemic. Influenza pandemics have a recurrence of somewhere between 35 and 40 years, but they occur irregularly, and so there is no real true cycle to that process. So pandemics and epidemics are clearly a very important part of human history and future human history, the future human affairs. And that, of course, will have to be integrated with our knowledge of technological disasters, the effects of terrorism worldwide and locally, climate change and everything that it means in terms of climate extremes and climate change adaptation. And also, I think we found in the last 4 years or so that the world has passed a threshold, a tipping point, into which displacement and migration are going to be much more the rule than they were before. Not that they were ever absent from human affairs, but they are going to be very, very important in the future, and we will need to get used to them and deal with them. So, one thing to bear in mind is that we need to, I think someone needs to mute a microphone, thank you. Okay. We need to look at the root causes of disaster, and particularly at vulnerability. Disaster is not really caused by hazard, it is triggered by hazard, but vulnerability really is the chief explainer of disasters. But in order to understand them, we need to look at root causes and contexts in order to see how risk is generated and how hazard impacts then precipitate risk as disaster. So we will look at one or two examples to clarify that. But in some ways, you could look at that as a sort of egg model or egg hypothesis. To understand disaster properly, we need to look at the immediate causes, the prima facie causes. We need to look at the root causes. We need to look at the vulnerabilities that underlie the root causes, that are worked upon by the forces that create disaster, exploited by them. We need to look at the dynamic pressures that precipitate the immediate causes, but that alone is probably not enough. We need to look at general vulnerability and things like poverty, deprivation, marginalization, wealth differentials, the distribution of livelihoods, and so on. And these may be factors that don't directly affect the occurrence of disasters or the likelihood of disaster occurring, but they certainly do affect those factors in the general mode of things. In other words, in order to understand why disasters occur, where they will occur, and what to do about them, really we need to understand these other factors. And that occurred to me when I was thinking about floods in the United Kingdom. And there are, of course, various strategies and policies to deal with floods. But really, do they mean anything to someone who is, for example, homeless or jobless? Probably not. And very often disasters are merely one of the problems that one has to deal with in life. We therefore need to analyze disasters in order to understand them well in terms of the interaction between disaster vulnerability, which is to say people who are exposed to disaster, how vulnerable are they to death, injury, destruction, damage, loss of livelihood, interruption of activities, and so on. But how does that fit into their general vulnerability, for example, to losing their livelihoods or to having very low income or no income at all, and so on? And how does that fit into things like the general global economy on which we all depend, even at the local level? How does that fit into the landscape of risk, not merely disaster risk, but other forms of risk as well? There are plenty of places in the world where disasters are serious, even catastrophic, but they're not one of the major risks. Other risks may be more important: road accidents, disease, short lives, and so on. So this all calls into question a number of factors which have sort of been taken for granted since about 1648 AD. 1648 and 1629 are key dates because they are dates at which international diplomacy fixed peace, which gave shape to the form of modern nations, and even those nations that were in no way related to that process, the Peace of Westphalia and all of that, have nevertheless taken the model of nationhood from that. But the model of nationhood is very much called into question by globalization and by some of the global forces that are going on. Curiously, if you look up disasters and then look up the term welfare, you very rarely, if ever, find a definition of welfare. Why not? Surely it's not a difficult thing to define? Well, the answer is that it's politically not very expedient at all to define welfare, because if you define it, then you have to put it into action. And what we've seen in COVID has been that there has been a massive rise in welfare, often insufficient, but nevertheless a rise, because in fact to keep society going at all, welfare is absolutely necessary. Identity is another. Modern identity only really has a history of a few hundred years. In some places, very much less. But identity is changing, and it's changing very, very rapidly at present. Entitlement, democracy. One thing that we tend to find is that more democratic society is, the better it is at managing disasters. And you can look at that in your own context by comparing different Indian states. If you find that in one state, the level of democracy you would regard as higher, then I think you'll find they're probably better at dealing with disasters. So, disaster, of course, is the fruit of that interaction between the hazards that cause the impact and the vulnerability that proliferates and propagates the impact, mitigated perhaps by resilience, the ability to withstand disaster. But what is most interesting about this, and what is one of the greatest challenges, is not to look at the individual systems. Can we manage disasters with technical systems? Do we have the right political decision making? Are we organized enough? What do the social systems tell us about ability to deal with disaster? No, the really interesting part is the interface between these systems. I've only managed to put 5 on the diagram for clarity, and of course there are others. Environmental systems are absolutely vitally important at present. It is the interface between these systems where the biggest challenges lie. So over time, we've generally gone ahead with what we might call the orthodox model that has lasted for the better part of 100 years. The physical event acts upon human vulnerability to give us the human consequences of disaster. In 1983, Kenneth Hewitt of Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada and many of his colleagues proposed what has sometimes been termed the radical critique. He said that human vulnerability is essentially the key to and the essence of disaster. A physical event merely triggers it. If you want to understand disaster, then you must look at human vulnerability first and foremost to understand the human consequences. But I think we now need a model something like this. We need to look at the context, the consequences of disaster as a plexus of factors that act upon human vulnerability to give us the human consequences. Physical events are in there, but culture and history as well have to be taken into account because they pose both opportunities and limitations regarding what we can achieve. So, pardon me, here is a model of vulnerability to disaster. It's the MOVE model, and MOVE was a European project for estimating and understanding vulnerability to disasters and climate change in Europe. And in that project, we looked very carefully at how we could divide up the various factors and put them together in some meaningful relationship. And this is a simplified version of it. There are, however, risks associated with using this sort of formulation. One of those is that we're actually dealing with a holistic phenomenon, vulnerability, which has physical, environmental, social, economic, etc. sides to it, but very often we cannot separate them out, and we shouldn't even try to. Plus, we also need to add context to this model. But vulnerability can be looked at in an entirely different way. Sometimes it's counterproductive to look at it in terms of economic vulnerability, physical vulnerability, psychological vulnerability, but instead to look at it in terms of process. For example, in total vulnerability, life is generally precarious for people who simply have no defenses against disaster. Perhaps, however, the principal factors are economic. In other words, that livelihoods are the key to surviving disaster, and they are the most vulnerable part of the equation. Or could it be that the riskiness of technology leads us to disaster? Or what about where corruption prevails, where negligence prevails, where political decision-making is simply inadequate, where bribery and we're siphoning off of funds and so on and so forth, really undermine any attempt to get disaster under control, and so on. But what is resilience? Since about 1981, and particularly since the early 2000s, much emphasis has been placed on trying to generate, develop, and emplace resilience. But is it an objective? Is it a process? Is it a strategy? Is it a paradigm? Or is it in fact more than one paradigm? Is it a question of restoring things to how they were before disaster struck? Or is it not bounce back at all, but bounce forward to a state of greater readiness and greater ability to resist disaster? At what scale should we apply resilience? Is it something you can do internationally, or is it a merely local thing? Is it really best to focus on the community scale? But what is community, and what scale does it operate at? Community is often mentioned, but the trouble with it is it can apply at almost any scale. I have a community of people I work with all over the world. We're in completely different places and time zones, and that too is a community. But of course, we also have street corner communities at the local scale. And can resilience reconcile dynamic and static elements of disasters and disaster prevention and mitigation? So, one of the problems of resilience as a concept is that it has been overcomplicated. I personally prefer a simple view of it, which is derived from 19th century views of mechanics, in which a material, when tested, perhaps clay or steel or wood, would have both brittle strength and the ability to bend, ductility. By analogy, society needs to have an optimum combination of resistance to disasters, in other words, hardening or hardness, and ability to adapt to the threat of disasters, in other words, to avoid or to mitigate the effects when they occur, if they cannot be avoided. And that really is a simple view of resilience, and I think that it can be counterproductive to try to complicate it more. But nevertheless, resilience does sit at the center of a whole variety of different things that go on and different views and fields. It has to interact in disaster terms with climate change adaptation, sustainability and the science behind that, and of course, managing all forms of other hazard and risk, everything from criminal activity to disease, and so on and so forth. So resilience is very definitely multifaceted. So we need to somehow balance our approach to vulnerability and to resilience, which means that we need to utilize to the best advantage our knowledge of vulnerability, as well as the threats and risks that it engenders. We need to utilize our current knowledge about the concept of resilience and how to apply it in the practical ways and at the local and practical levels where it needs to be applied. We need to study the human organization in crisis situations, and this is very interesting to study in the context of COVID-19, not the least because it's highly variable from one place to another, from one country to another, but very often from one region to another within a country, if not from one town to another. And we can see highly varied results from that. And there are many lessons. We need a gap analysis. Where are we not doing enough? We need a resilience matrix. What do we need to achieve? And how do we need to weave together the different elements of resilience in order to make something holistic that will work? We need to look at the interactions between vulnerability and resilience. And in that, we need a theoretical model. And that's what I'm going to try and provide to you. Let's look at cascading disasters. And why cascading disasters? Well, the answer is that in the view of myself and my research group, virtually all disasters, unless they're very, very small and very, very simple, will be cascading events. And one reason for that is that we live in network societies. Even those where there is very little money and very few resources are network societies. We find, for example, that cattle herders in Southern Africa depend upon mobile telephones, and that is part of the networked world. So cascading disasters, what are they? Well, we firstly could think of them in simple terms according to the toppling dominoes idea, knock-on effects. One thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. That's the simple view. But also it's a question of linking the realities in the both physical and social domains. In other words, we have physical impacts, but they have a variety, a spread, a chain, and a network of social repercussions. Then we have compound and interconnected risks. In other words, one risk can trigger another. It may be that the triggering risk, the initial risk, is not the important one. It may be that other risks are more important. Even in COVID, we're definitely seeing this as there is that delicate balancing mechanism between the socioeconomic disaster and the health and medical disaster. And that really is the mother of all cascading events. We see nonlinear progress of cascading disasters, and we see risks that are amplified by vulnerabilities that come into play. And we see this happening at multiple scales with the activation of secondary risks. And one way that we can look at this is that very often the key is electricity. Now, you've probably heard of blue sky thinking. In other words, you look at the blue sky and you think very creatively and very freely. Well, my research group does a great deal of black sky thinking. What to do when the lights go out. A picture here of Venezuela, it suffered considerable power outages and had to adapt to them. But they've also occurred in all sorts of places. For example, two examples here in the United States, Eastern Seaboard. Large areas as a result of grid failures with no electrical power. But what does that mean? Does it simply mean that you can't use your computer and eventually you can't use your telephone? Or does it mean more than that? Does it mean your life is in danger? So in fact, electricity failure among somewhere between 8 and 11 major categories of critical infrastructure is really the key to the others, because electricity is involved in all of these. For example, it pumps water and sewerage. It is essential to communications, which nowadays are largely governed by electronics. Food toxicity results from the failure of refrigeration. Banking is heavily dependent on electricity, if not totally dependent on it. The food and fuel supply are both dependent on electricity. For example, fuel is electrically pumped, and much transportation is dependent on electricity one way or another. So in fact, social factors are also heavily dependent on the supply of electricity. Can we really rely on it? Electricity failure is quite common in India, but it's quite common in many other parts of the world, rich and poor. Now, if we look also at the triple disaster in Japan, earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear release, and the subsequent 9 years of recovery, and one of the most complex and challenging recovery problems in the world, that also is a major cascading event in many respects. For example, I have twice been to Fukushima Daiichi and stood in the middle of that photograph with radiation beaming at me at the rate of about 350 chest x-rays. And it is awesome. But the nuclear release from 4 reactors at Fukushima Daiichi effectively destroyed a relationship of trust between the Japanese people, their government, and scientists. And it has taken 9 years of painstaking work to try to restore that trust. But trust is essential in disaster risk reduction. If we look at the case of Eyjafjallajökull, it was a minor Icelandic volcano. But in April 2010, it erupted to the point where we had volcanic ash in the stratosphere over more than 70% of Europe, which shut down 70% of Europe's airports. Here are the major airports, and few of them were open. Some were shut for a week. And that meant that 8.5 million people were stranded. It also meant that commerce shut down wherever air travel was implicated. It was a rather difficult situation with tremendous imbalances in normal life, but it was a short-term one. One thing to bear in mind about this is that there are much larger Icelandic volcanoes that could cover Europe and beyond with very much more volcanic ash for very much longer periods of time. But of course, since then, we've seen a ground stop in civil aviation and a radical reorganization of the whole industry as a result of COVID and people's reluctance to fly, or in fact, the closure of national borders. But we can also apply cascading principles to much smaller events. For example, in 2017, this 24-story residential building burnt in London with the loss of 72 lives. And there is now an inquiry which is sitting as I speak into this. And this has become a national cause célèbre. And if you look at it, what you find is that it has many different elements to it, many different aspects. And I would say that really the cause of this disaster is not the flammability of the cladding of the building, the fact that it caught fire. There you can see a piece of the cladding on fire falling off the building. That was the immediate cause. But in fact, the real cause was ideological. It was the decimation of building regulations and the inspection regime that went with them. But then the disaster propagated because, although it says here 314 dangerous residential towers were found to exist in the United Kingdom, the answer is actually 511. In fact, more were discovered subsequently. So we have a situation of extreme risk all over the country in buildings of this kind. And we currently have a fight over the question of who is responsible for that. And that is one of the propagating, cascading effects of this disaster. Others include dangerous urban pollution of soil and air, and ongoing issues with welfare and equity. Who pays for this? Who houses the people left homeless by it? Whose fault is it? Who accepts responsibility for it? And so on. These are all part of the cascade. And it is perhaps an illustration of how you could use the idea of a triggering event and then a cascade through the critical infrastructure and through the relations between different kinds of vulnerability, which of course can have a whole variety of different effects, some of which may well be worse than the triggering event itself. In fact, in the UK, even if we look merely at that one residential fire, there have been several tall building fires since then that could well have had a higher death toll had they occurred at different times of day. So the simple model then, on the left, part A, is the toppling dominoes idea of one effect leading to another, leading to another. For example, you have high rainfall, it leads to high river discharge, it leads to overtopping of a reservoir dam, it leads to the beginnings of flood downstream, it leads to the potential collapse of the dam, it leads to the need for evacuation, it leads to questions of how to look after the evacuees, it leads to damage to agriculture, it leads to loss of revenue and livelihood and accommodation, and so on and so forth. But you can also have escalation points. It's one of the key issues in cascading disasters, the escalation point where the interaction of vulnerabilities can increase the power of the event, the destructive power, to create disasters, and can lead to new directions of propagation of the cascade. And that is the result of the interaction of different kinds of vulnerability. For example, in COVID, we've seen huge increases in the demand for mental health services. That's one issue, for example. We've had a huge increase in mental dis-ease, mental problems as a result of lockdown, loss of livelihood, and all the things that go with this pandemic. So in fact, there are many different ways in which vulnerabilities can interact to increase the power of disaster. And that's what we need to study, especially in emergency planning. Look at where the things interact in order to know what to plan for. We also need to look at the ways that different risks interact. For example, we have NATEX, in other words, natural events that trigger technological disasters, such as toxic spills or explosions. And we've had a number of events where, for example, floods have entered factories and caused fires, explosions, and toxic clouds. That is a simple example of an ATEC of the interaction between different kinds of risks. We also need to look very carefully at environmental drivers of interacting risk. and how they too can lead to cascades. So what is risk in terms of its disaster potential? Well, compounded risk, where we have multiple extreme events. That, of course, we saw with the earthquake and tsunami in Japan and a variety of other places too. Interacting risk, where we have environmental problems that interact with disaster potential. Interconnected risk, where the natural, human, and technological systems interact. One thing about COVID, by the way, is that we knew the scenario for COVID from the period 2003 to 2009 when it was put together. In fact, we had a perfectly good idea of what was going to happen. In fact, I taught it for 11 years before it did happen, not because I'm particularly clever, but simply because I've read the literature. So that enabled us to know that, in fact, a pandemic is something where you've got both the medical side and the socioeconomic side, and you cannot easily say that the medical side is worse than the socioeconomic, or vice versa. And of course, we have cascading risk, where tightly coupled systems propagate through critical infrastructure, and perhaps some combination of all of this. Don't forget coronal mass ejections, space weather, and you can get onto the internet and get today's space weather forecast. Why is this important? Well, in fact, a coronal mass ejection or sunspot can give you a situation 15 to 18 hours later where we have potentially large damage to communications and global navigation satellites, where we have loss of electricity on a wide and large scale. And in the case of a so-called Carrington event, which is a very large collection of sunspots, then we could easily have trillions of dollars of damage. And if you think that's unlikely, one of these narrowly missed the Earth in 2012. The last one to hit it was 1859. But in prehistoric times, there was such an event 10 times larger. So in point of fact, geoelectrical currents, geomagnetic currents, and plasma in the Earth's atmosphere can cause very considerable damage to electrical systems. When I say damage to transformers, I mean transformers the size of a room. They're actually made in India and they take a year to make. And hence, this could lead to very long interruptions to electricity with all the cascading effects that occurs. So, in fact, a Carrington event could be quite a serious thing to be concerned about and to be ready for. So, here's a magnitude scale for cascading events. Perhaps the Japanese earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear release is an M5. But you can, in planning, compare events on the basis of their magnitude and use these in creating scenarios for cascades so that by planning for emergencies, you can look for the events and the consequences and the interactions that you need to plan for and would otherwise forget. So do not focus only on the trigger of an event, for example, heavy rainfall or a cyclone. Yes, you need to understand those, of course, but look at the strategic and tactical levels of what to do about the consequences. Look at the different fields: psychology, sociology, architecture, engineering, geology, meteorology, and how they fit together. Look at the way that policies and plans could be induced, modified to take account of possible cascades. Broaden the impact analysis. Look at different kinds of impact. Look at them in a comparative way to see which is more important. Use impact trees. What leads from one thing to another? Identify escalation points. Where are you going to get interactions that worsen the situation? And what is going to be most important? What do you really have to worry about? And then you can subject these to stress tests, which are perhaps merely theoretical ways of working through the scenario to say, well, what's going to happen if we take the last great cyclone and apply it to a set of conditions? What actually comes out of this? And things like that. And the world is changing dynamically all the time, so you need to keep doing this. What was valid yesterday won't be entirely valid tomorrow, which is why it must be redone. Now, a quick word about the Sendai framework. It's what we all tend to work by, but it is very much a top-down sort of approach. I'm rather skeptical about it. It's a non-binding agreement. Does it really lead to action? It can enable unscrupulous politicians to be legitimized at home and abroad, and there's plenty of evidence of that, although I'd prefer to remain neutral right now and not cite it. And perhaps disaster risk reduction isn't really a top-down process. The theatre of operations in any disaster, for example, the Indian Ocean tsunami, 13 nations involved, but it was still a local affair. If you cannot manage it at the level of fishing villages, tourist resorts, coastal communities, you can't manage it at all. So is disaster risk reduction top-down? You can harmonise it from above, but you have to do it locally. And the UN processes do tend to use evidence rather selectively, and although they try hard to encourage accountability, is it really there? Now, at the local level, of course, there is the Safe Cities Initiative, a 10-point action plan. It gets together the mayors of cities that have signed up to it, and they can exchange information, and that's a very good thing. The background, by the way, shows Bogota in Colombia. Field assessment and implementation of the 10-point action plan are emphasized, and that's good. You can sign up for this initiative, but only about 1% of urban areas around the world have actually signed up to it. But it does at least throw emphasis on things like safe schools and safe health facilities, both of which are absolutely vital and essential. So it does have its good points. But on the other hand, take the case of Venice, which was adopted as a role model. Well, is it a role model? It's certainly got a good publicity department, but this is Venice on an ordinary day. Does that look safe to you? It's a real picture. That happens twice a day in Venice. They haven't managed to ban cruise ships. Actually, it probably doesn't happen now because nobody's taking cruises during the pandemic. But until the pandemic, this was happening twice a day, and highly dangerous too. If one of these misnavigates, then you could have huge oil spills, you could have great damage, and you could have a listing ship in the middle of one of the most fragile and valuable urban areas in the world. And that is not my idea of resilience. So questions about the Sendai framework. Do we really need it, first and foremost? Well, there are justifications for it, and we certainly need international collaboration. So perhaps we do. But will it have an impact? Is it reducing losses? And that really is a very debatable question. I don't have the answer. And are there alternatives? Are there better alternatives? Is it all better done at the local level and aggregated upwards? Who will hold governments to account? The UN can't do it. It does not have the mandate. On the other hand, we can try and shame governments. And have we got the right wording? The wording was achieved very painfully by about 87 different countries actively negotiating overnight until the very last moment. And in many cases, trying to wriggle out of their obligation to their own citizens. And can such a document ever be anything but top-down? Does it matter that it's only top-down? Well, I think it does matter, actually. And you can take any official document, and you can look at it using a search engine to see how many times the word should appears. And you can make the should ratio, the number of shoulds per page is 0.38 in the Sendai framework, which is not bad. But the word should appears 21 times. Well, we all should. We should do many different things. I should be doing things that I haven't done. But we need to replace the word should with will, shall, and must. Above all, with must. Governments must do the following, not they should do the following. And really, do targets have any meaning if we're still creating the conditions for disasters, especially in the wealth differential where the rich get richer and the rich are likely by 2030 to command and control 2/3 of the world's wealth if things don't change. And that has enormous implications for the control of diseases and disaster. Science, for whom is it? And who decides for whom it is? Is science really for the poor and the dispossessed? Does it help them? How can we make it help them? Does the Sendai framework enable science to help people? And what frameworks will produce results when governments are corrupt or unethical? And there are plenty of unethical, corrupt governments around the world, or degrees of corruption. And if it's all applied at the national level, is the national level still the best level to do things? Does national policy really matter? And that, of course, is particularly relevant in any kind of federal republic, such as India, Germany, the United States, or so on. Perhaps instead there are other levels where things are best done. One thing I found about COVID is that it seems to be best managed where the management is not nationally coordinated, well, coordinated perhaps, but it's not done nationally, it's devolved to the regional level. Although this can lead to startling variations in the ability to manage regionally. And so really, is a top-down culture healthy or unhealthy? And those are all questions that can be debated. I certainly wouldn't wish to propose absolute answers to any of them, but there's certainly things you can think about. And sometimes merely thinking it through is better than having an outright answer. So to conclude, some issues for disaster risk reduction. Somehow we have to bridge the wealth gap. We cannot afford, in a world that has 87 tax havens, $9 trillion worth of wealth, which are simply stored away in them, and massive need, an increasing need worldwide. The world has missed its goals on poverty reduction and environmental protection, and that really is not good. So we have the wrong kind of globalization. Globalization itself is not inherently wrong, and indeed the best thing you can do is learn from other countries, other situations, other parts of the world, rich and poor. But we don't need the kind of globalization that leads to exploitation, extraction of wealth, and impoverishment, marginalization. Gender is absolutely fundamental. It is the key to very, very many things here. And so that is something that needs to be addressed every time and in every single context. Power structures, likewise, human rights, where human rights are in any way curtailed, it curtails the access to information and the ability to act to reduce disaster risk. So does corruption. We have that uneasy dialogue or duality between military aid and humanitarian aid. Can we swing the balance towards the latter? We've had consensuses around the world, but are they disintegrating in these times of identity politics? And that is a contextual factor of enormous importance. Well, really, I've asked the questions, I haven't given the answer, so perhaps I should end by apologizing. But from the website of my university and my institute, you can download this report on how to look at the scenario for COVID and derive lessons of it from it for emergency planning and emergency management, perhaps for future pandemics, if not for the rest of the present one. And it was an attempt to codify that. Nothing very novel about it, but it is at least a systematic approach. You can also find some essays on my blog spot, there, emergency-planning, and about 124 different presentations in languages on SlideShare at the address at the bottom here. So thank you very much for listening, and that is the end of my presentation.